I would like to thank our distinguished panelists in the first panel and those who are to come for joining us here today. And thank them for sharing their thoughts about the opioid epidemic and other escalating health threats that will inform our thoughts and actions on these issues going forward. From one who is a recovering governor, myself, as well as a recovering congressman, I might add, I'd just like to thank Governor Baker for making the time to get here for the discussion. Obviously, he had to go through a difficult transition to be here, and we appreciate that. His leadership as an advocate for medical and health research in Massachusetts and nationwide is commendable, and we are proud to be your partner. I'd also like to thank Congressman Kennedy, with whom I served, for his obviously zeal that he has for dealing with this problem and for being very candid about his own problems that existed before. I think it makes a big difference. That we have had 2 of the 5 commissioners on the President's Commission on combating drug addiction and the opioid crisis with us today is remarkable. Governor Baker and Congressman Kennedy, you are helping our nation overcome a crisis that is wreaking havoc on individuals, families, and communities across the nation. Thank you for your commitment and leadership. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Commissioner for the Food and Drug Administration, Dr. Scott Gottlieb. Dr. Gottlieb was sworn in as the 23rd FDA Commissioner in May. As a physician, policy expert, and public health advocate, Dr. Gottlieb is extraordinarily well equipped to lead an agency that oversees products that account for about 20 cents of every dollar consumers spend each year. In his few short months as Commissioner, Dr. Gottlieb has laid out clear goals and has been knocking them out one by one. Like his predecessors, one of whom, Mark McClellan, is joining us on the next panel, Dr. Gottlieb is demonstrating the caliber of leadership it takes to assure that products seeking the agency's stamp of approval are safe and effective, all while putting patients at the heart of his work. We at Research America are proud and privileged to be advocates for the FDA. Welcome, Dr. Gottlieb.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's actually it's about almost 25 cents of every dollar, and that's not because the economy is shrinking. I probably shouldn't say it's because the regulatory state's growing, but it's because Congress has given us a lot of new responsibilities in recent years. So the scope of the FDA's mission has expanded dramatically in a number of years, and in particular the time period since I was last at the agency about a decade ago as a deputy commissioner. I wanted to talk about preclinical research today. Last week, FDA approved, as many of you might know, the first gene therapy product in the United States. The new treatment was targeted toward a rare form of pediatric blood cancer. It will initially be indicated for just a few hundred patients a year. Those numbers shouldn't taper the enormous milestone that was crossed in the approval of this product, nor the meaningful benefit that some patients are going to derive. Some very young patients and very sick patients are going to derive from the hopeful therapy. For many decades, we've grappled with the science to enable us to alter the gene sequences underlying disease as a way to treat human illness. Excuse me with my whatever. Using the tools of gene therapy. And there have been many scientific and human setbacks along the way, as many of us are familiar with. But the technology to do these things continue to advance owing to the perseverance of scientists, the persistence of sponsors that were dedicated to these endeavors, and most of all, the patients who continued to brave the uncertainty of clinical trials that were key to evaluating these new methods. A long series of small breakthroughs along the way, all consolidated into advances that enabled these new platforms to progress, not least of which, in the case of gene therapy, was the advent of reliable vectors for delivering the gene sequences. And so we've now reached a momentous inflection point in science. FDA currently has more than 550 active investigational new drug applications related to gene therapy products, and we have 76 investigational new drug applications, active investigational new drug applications related to CAR T-cell products. And we have hundreds more that aren't active at this time. Gene therapy is just one of a number of new platforms that are coming to fruition as a novel means to treat disease. 2 decades ago, we made some fundamental advances in life sciences with the firming of the science and the tools around genomics and proteomics. Now that basic science is being fully translated into therapeutic products that may radically alter the course of medicine and arrest the progress of some intractable diseases. But a lot of our policies, and yes, our regulatory framework, are fashioned to a much different paradigm of science and drug development. And so we're challenged to see how we adapt those policies to make sure that we have the right framework to properly evaluate the safety and effectiveness of these new technology platforms. The recently passed Cures Act gave us certain tools and resources to address these challenges, but we know much work remains, and our ability to fully capitalize on this science and maintain FDA's gold standard for product review means that FDA also needs to modernize itself along with the new platforms that we're evaluating. This modernization process has been underway for many years. It was crystallized with the formation of the Critical Path Initiative when I was last at FDA under the leadership of Dr. Mark McClellan, who's here with us today and will be on the next panel. Now at FDA, we're going to be taking some fresh steps to continue to advance similar ambitions as it relates to the development challenges associated with these very novel platforms that we're seeing now. We need to be able to make sure that our policies match the complexity of the novel science that's being harnessed to attack disease. And to accomplish this, we need to ask ourselves some new questions. For one matter, how do we adjust our approach when the primary complexity and uncertainty inherent in a new product isn't the clinical question related to whether it works, but the features of the delivery platform or how it's being manufactured? And what do we do, for example, when the most complicated risks aren't acute toxicities that can be observed up front? Instead, they're long-term and more theoretical risks and uncertainties, such as the potential for off-target effects of gene therapy interventions. These questions challenge us to adjust our regulatory policies and think differently about our overall mission, especially when it comes to complex products that are part of intricate delivery systems. These are situations where the products are delivered transiently and sometimes are just a single administration, but they have sustained effects. In these situations, determining safety and effectiveness doesn't boil down to a judgment made at a single point in time. It's not a binary measure, a single discrete threshold. The proper evaluation of safety is an ongoing process, and it crosses over the threshold of initial approval. This means more emphasis needs to be placed on how new technologies perform in clinical use during routine care. Long-term risks and benefits need to be carefully monitored, and this is similar to the way we evaluate many medical devices. Our questions related to these platforms would increasingly relate to their long-term performance. More of our emphasis will naturally shift to our post-market tools. Over the coming months, I'm going to be talking more about some of the steps we're taking and steps we plan to take to adapt our regulatory principles to the new challenges we face in properly evaluating a very different set of scientific opportunities. At a speech I'll be giving Monday at RAPS, I plan to talk about the steps we're taking during the clinical stages of development to make that process more efficient and more effective. And then at the end of the month, I'm speaking at the National Press Club, and I plan to address how FDA approaches its broader role as a medical staff and the post-market obligations that accompany our stewardship over the evolution of the full life cycle of a product. But today I want to start that conversation by talking about how FDA approaches the early preclinical stages of development. I want to highlight some of the new efforts we're undertaking as part of our overall approach to this new technology under a new strategic policy roadmap that we'll unveil soon, and that I'll outline more of our policies very shortly. First, we're adopting new policies for earlier engagement with product developers. These are especially relevant when it comes to those working in very novel areas of science. Our evidence shows that earlier and more frequent engagement can help make the initial stages of development more efficient and increase the odds of success. And we know that academic and individual medical sponsors, as well as startups and some small biotechnology companies, sometimes don't have a full understanding of what it will take to get an IND or to get a BLA filed with the FDA for their product. It's often the smaller companies or the individual researchers who are working with the most novel technology platforms as well. And so at FDA, therefore, we're encouraging very early meetings to give more early feedback to product developers. These efforts are particularly prominent in the Office of Tissues and Advanced Therapies in our Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research. Increasingly, these meetings occur very early during the non-clinical or preclinical work for the IND. It's been our experience and our observation that some sponsors sometimes overestimate the amount of information needed to file an IND, and that too many times the cost of development therefore get front-loaded, increasing the cost of initiating new science. Ideally, it would be easier to get products into development with more of the cost pushed further out after some of the initial preclinical work is already done and there's a better understanding of whether the new product has clinical promise. Toward these goals, the FDA review staff is sometimes able to help significantly streamline early development processes by eliminating unnecessary preclinical tests or by suggesting optimal preclinical or clinical designs such as more adaptive trials for early stage research or Bayesian approaches to statistical evaluation of results where randomization is not possible in early stage clinical trials. Our Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, under the leadership of Peter Marks, will be further clarifying to academic and industrial developers how we will foster the development of innovative products through the kinds of early substantive interactions I described earlier. These new approaches to preclinical scientific engagement will also be featured in educational material that we'll be making available to sponsors. Our drug center has been implementing similar approaches to these preclinical processes. We're going to be taking other new steps to make sure that our policies governing early preclinical science are more closely matched to the complexion of modern technologies. One is evidenced in how clinical trials are initially designed. In certain cases, there are a lot of common features across the same platform, even if it's used to target different genes or proteins. There may be plausible reasons to recognize how a product or platform can work across multiple disease states and leverage the learning from one setting into other opportunities. So how do we make sure we're efficiently taking advantage of these opportunities? For example, we may be able to take a more adaptive approach in our preclinical evaluation of different therapies that share a lot of common characteristics in the overall platform used to deliver a gene product. Consider two gene therapy vectors that contain CRISPR constructs differing only by one base pair. These two products might not need the same early amount of preclinical data for the second variant as was required for the first one, if we can borrow what we learn across different clinical applications of the same basic construct. By comparison, if the CRISPR inserts were different at 5 or more base pairs, that might require more data. The bottom line is this: we need to carefully but efficiently evolve our preclinical regulatory models to adjust to what we need as the science evolves and indicates what is critically necessary for the safe application of the new technology. These are just some of the new steps we're taking to modernize the preclinical aspects of drug development. I'll have more to say on these issues, as well as steps we're taking to address the other stages of drug development very soon. And we will make sure we stay firm to FDA's gold standard for product review while embracing these new technology platforms. These new platforms are the practical outgrowth of gene and protein-based science that was firmly established just a few decades ago. And we're at a point in the history of medicine that's similar to other great inflections in science, where fundamental principles of science and medicine became firmly established as part of a great leap in public health. Our aim is to make sure our policies match the sophistication of the science we're asked to evaluate and help enable this new paradigm of beneficial innovation. That's going to be a big focus of my Medical Innovation Access Plan, parts of which we've already announced, and our forthcoming strategic policy roadmap. This roadmap will serve as an organizing framework, a strategic plan for unveiling and advancing the major policy efforts we plan to undertake across all our centers. Today, I focus just on some of the steps we're taking with respect to the preclinical aspects of drug review. In the coming weeks, I will discuss how these same policy goals will be made evident in how we approach the clinical portion of the drug development process and our life cycle approach to medical product stewardship. I want to thank you for having me here today. I hope I left time for questions, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks a lot.
Hi, Scott. Thank you. That was really helpful. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of the patient as you begin to take a look at the changes that you want to make in the drug development process.
We're going to look for ways to make the patient participation in clinical development more transparent, more systematic. So we'll be announcing soon that we're going to be standing up a new office inside the Office of the Commissioner under the leadership of the Principal Deputy Commissioner, Rachel Sherman, that will be focused on coordinating patient engagement across all the medical product centers. And so that's something we'll probably do within maybe the next 3 or 4 weeks. This will be a policy coordinating function to try to make sure we have consistent practices across the different aspects of medical product review. It's not going to dislodge the relationships that patient groups and patients currently have with medical product centers, but if there are best practices that we think we should be democratizing across the agency or borrowing some of the things CDRH may be doing well into the drug development process inside CDER, those are the kinds of opportunities we want to pursue. And so this new policymaking function, which is going to be a small office, we're not looking to build a very large office, but we do feel we need to have some kind of central policymaking function inside an Office of Medical Policy that will report to the Principal Deputy.
Scott, Susan Denser, a member of the Research America Board. Thank you so much for your talk. And as you mentioned, the approval of Kymriah represents just a major, exciting new development for all of us who've experienced cancer in our own families. I have a question about post-market surveillance in particular and real-world evidence accumulation. And as you mentioned, as we look at the long-term effects of these therapies, the unknowns obviously are vast in number. I presume you're going to make some comments on this when you unveil the strategic plan and roadmap for the FDA, but what kinds of investments do you think we need to make as a country in the data infrastructure to continue to harvest the benefits of real-world evidence, particularly in the face of these dramatic advances in gene therapy and related therapies?
Yeah, it's been a little bit of a frustration because we've been talking about the ability to do more real-time surveillance using databases and real-time collection of information, the ability to access electronic medical records for a very long time. This is something I remember Dr. McClellan talking about 12, 13 years ago at the FDA when I was there with him. We've made a lot of progress, obviously, but we're still not quite at the point where we can certainly do very reliable real-time active surveillance. We're still dependent upon doing retrospective analytical work, oftentimes on payer databases with Sentinel in the drug context. In the device context, it's more difficult because the payer databases oftentimes don't track the individual medical devices, just the procedure that was done. So in that realm, you're more dependent upon systematic registries and prospective registries where you can collect data and also trying to align more closely with EMRs that might have data on what the medical devices we use and not just a particular procedure. I mean, we are certainly working on this inside the FDA, trying to look at what we need to do from a policy standpoint to continue to advance this. We just put out a guidance document from CDRH on a definition of real-world evidence. We'll try to come up with a standard definition and talk about the different clinical circumstances where RWE can become a more meaningful component of both the pre-approval as well as the post-approval process. So where can we use RWE as an important component of the pre-market review of a product, and how should the RWE be collected? What standards does it need to meet in order to fit into certain places in the pre-market approval process where it might supplant other kinds of data collection. So that was an important articulation from CDRH, and we're looking to try to develop a more consistent policy across the entire medical product center. But I don't think, to answer your question, I'm not sure there's one sort of silver bullet that's going to make this sort of vision come into full fruition. I think it's a slow evolution. It is going to become more important as we have these products come to market that have theoretical risks associated with them around off-target effects when you're talking about things like gene technology, CRISPR, gene therapy, where you might want to follow patients for a very long period of time, but you're going to want to do it in a way that isn't overly intrusive into the patient's life if you're following them for a decade or longer. And so we're going to need to figure out new constructs to do that. And we've developed some. We've already operationalized some of these. But we need to look differently at it. One of the things I'm going to be talking about later on is just how we think about the pre-market drug review process more generally, and think of the mission and the role of the review staff more broadly as not just individuals who are focused on the review metrics and the PDUFA goals, and those are extremely important because they help us discipline our process and they help us impose good management on the review process. But the drug review process is about more than just meeting the deadlines. It's about taking a holistic approach to the life cycle of the product and making sure that the people who work on drug reviews are also very closely integrated to how we think about the post-market safety of those products. And I think that's going to become more important, especially with some of these new platforms where the complexity isn't necessarily does it work clinically. It might be very obvious as providing a clinical benefit, but the complexity relates to all these other issues, the product features and the post-market considerations. Sure.
Hey, Mary. Commissioner, you've spoken very eloquently about the opioid crisis being a top priority for you, and having also worked within CMS, and what I understand is you're a key advisor to those trying to come up with a good, coherent healthcare policy for our country. Could you just talk a little bit about the more coherent strategy that you see the administration pulling together to address this opiate epidemic?
Well, I can talk about how I'm thinking about it from the FDA standpoint. That's not to skirt the question. I think it's most important that I think about it from the perspective of the FDA. We obviously have an important role to play across the entire continuum. We look at things like, abuse deterrent formulations, medically assisted therapy. There's ways that we can help advance non-addictive pain products, and we're looking at all of those opportunities. But I think perhaps the biggest role that FDA can play in trying to address this crisis is in reducing overall exposure and helping solve the new addiction crisis. I mean, it's going to take a very concerted effort by a lot of people to address the current addiction crisis, and we are certainly part of that and trying to do our part. But I think where FDA has a outsized influence is on a new addiction crisis, because we know most people who become addicted to opioids become medically addicted. Their first exposure is going to be through a legitimate clinical prescription, or at least a clinical prescription, because we might sometimes question the appropriateness of certain prescriptions. And we also know a certain percentage of people who are exposed to opioids in a clinical setting will inevitably become addicted to opioids. And so in order to reduce addiction, we need to reduce exposure. And the ways we're going to do that is to make sure fewer prescriptions are written, so that prescriptions, when they are written, they're medically appropriate and physicians have considered other alternatives. And when they do get written, they're written for dosages that comport with the clinical circumstance for which the prescription was indicated in the first place. So, no more 30-day supplies for tooth extraction. The only circumstance in which you might require 30 days of opioid therapy for a dental procedure is if you've developed a horrible complication, which you should be going back to your doctor. And so we think that there are things we can do within our regulatory toolbox, thinking differently about those tools to actually affect those two goals, whether it's how we require education of physicians, or what steps we can take to actually encourage more controlled dispensing, so that you might see more 3 or 5 or 7 day doses dispensed rather than 30-day supplies. We actually think that there are things that we can do. We're going to be putting out a Federal Register notice very soon that's going to articulate some of our thinking here. But to give you one example, if we can build into, if we can work with provider groups to build into the labeling of these products, what the appropriate dispensing should be for different indications. So, for example, work with the Dental Association to build into labeling a recommendation that any dental procedure really shouldn't be more than a 5 or 7 day supply of opioids. We could put that into current labeling. That could be used as a way to help regulate dispensing at the pharmacy counter. So there are ways to achieve these goals through regulatory tools and working with the provider community. And we're going to look at how we can use our existing regulatory toolbox more creatively to try to address these goals. Because the reality is, I think the only way we're really going to solve this crisis and the enormity of it, it's going to be very hard to solve. Is if we also bend the rate of new addiction. And so we have to focus on addressing that aspect of the crisis as well. Thanks a lot.